Okay, so we're going to continue with our discussion on American imperialism. This is Module 7, Lesson 2 on the Spanish-American War. Our unit on imperialism kind of shows the American perspective on creating its first empire or starting its empire, while the rest of the world and, well, Europe is trying to amass more and more colonies and trying to create their own empires. And so now it's America who is stepping in and saying, well, let's do this, or let's be a part of this imperialism as well. So, how much of an influence do you really think the media has on how you think? Most people are going to agree that today the media has a lot of influence on how the American people interpret what's happening in the world today. And so it's really no different back in the late 1800s. James Creelman, he is going to travel to Cuba as a New York World reporter, and he's going to cover the Second Cuban War for Independence from Spain. And while he's in Havana, he's going to write his observations about the Spanish atrocities and what's going on as they fight for independence. What he's doing is trying to arouse American support for this, and how he's going to do this is by kind of exaggerating his stories a little bit, because making them more dramatic sounding is going to really boost those sales and provoke American intervention in his mind, because, you know, if you're arousing support from the American public, and that's going to ultimately have an impact on policy. And so, kind of coming back to our imperialism age, by the end of the 19th century, Spain, who had kind of once been one of the most powerful colonial nations on the earth, had really lost a lot of its colonies, and it only maintained the Philippines and the island of Guam in the Pacific, and then a few outposts in Africa, which a lot of European countries were trying to get a piece of Africa at that point. And then they also held the Caribbean islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Americas. And so, because Cuba is so close to the United States, it's only 90 miles off the coast of Florida, the United States is going to suggest to buy Cuba from Spain. And Spain's going to respond with, well, we would rather see it at the bottom of the ocean rather than in your hands. So that is, you know, obviously going to be a no from them. But Cubans are also not happy with their situation under Spanish rule. And so the Cubans are actually going to rebel twice. And there's going to be some American support here. Their first rebellion is actually unsuccessful, but what they do manage to accomplish is to get slavery abolished from that island. And so after the emancipation of Cuban slaves, American capitalists are going to start investing millions of dollars in large sugarcane plantations on that island. So one of the Cuban nationalists, Jose Marti, is going to be exiled in New York, and he is going to launch a revolution in 1895, the Second Revolution. And he's going to organize the resistance against Spain using active guerrilla warfare and deliberately destroying property on the island, especially those American sugar plantations, because what he's trying to do is, by destroying American interests on the island, you're kind of poking the bear. You're telling, you know, you're wanting intervention. You're like, hey, come look at this, come help this. You don't want this to happen, so come do something about it. But the American public is split on whether or not they want to intervene. Okay, many of the business people, they're going to want the government to support Spain in order to protect their investments. But other Americans are very enthusiastic about a rebel cause, because they see that as, you know, a common ancestry, really, because of our fight for independence and our fight from colonial rule. And their cry of Cuba Libre is very similar to our give me liberty or give me death. And so, there is going to be a big push from the American public to help the Cuban issue. So in 1896, Spain is going to respond to the Second Revolt by sending General Valeriano Weyler to Cuba to restore order. And he's going to try to crush this rebellion by herding the rural population of the concentration camps so that they cannot help these rebels. So it's estimated that there's about 300,000 people in these camps. And this is obviously going to make headline news in the United States. So you have the New York Journal and the New York World fighting for readers, and they're going to exaggerate the accounts of what's going on in Cuba under Weyler's rule. And so you're going to hear stories or read stories about poisoned wells and children being thrown to the sharks, which are just going to make the American people just be like, oh my goodness, what is happening here? We need to intervene. Why are we not helping people? And really this is a tactic. This is a tactic to bring in readers and to help sell papers, and it's just known as yellow journalism. And you're going to have a little mini project using yellow journalism tactics, but there's more to come on that here soon. And so Hearst and Pulitzer, who are major writers for these two papers, are going to fan war fever, and Hearst is going to send a really gifted artist into Cuba to draw sketches of the reporter's stories. And he's going to inform the publisher that, you furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. And so this is something that, the media is trying to provoke something here. This war fever is only going to escalate with what we call the Delome letter. Okay. When President McKinley takes office in 1897, the demand for American intervention in Cuba is on the rise. But McKinley is he's not ready to go to war with Spain. So he's going to try diplomatic means to resolve the crisis. And so at first, all of his efforts seem to be succeeding pretty well. Spain asks General Weyler to modify they take him out of Cuba and they modify the policy regarding concentration camps. And they're actually going to offer Cuba a limited self-government. But we get to this Delome letter. And so in February of 1898, the New York Journal published a private letter written by a Spanish minister to the United States. He had stolen the letter from the Havana post office and leaked it to the newspaper, which was obviously looking for something juicy to post in its papers because they're trying to sell these newspapers. And so this letter criticized President McKinley, calling him weak and a bidder for the administration of the crowd. And so this actually really embarrassed the Spanish government, and they are going to apologize. The minister resigns, but a lot of Americans are really angry over the insult to their president. And this is where we'll stop today. But we see this escalation and this involvement of the press and what they're trying to do here. And so we're just kind of like in a ticking time bomb situation with this. And we'll continue our discussion on this tomorrow.